Welcome back to my channel. I love to have you here, and for those of you who are new, I am Stephanie and I love learning languages and sharing what I've learned along the way with you here on YouTube. And in this video, I want to talk about reading. Reading is something that I've talked about quite a lot before. I've mentioned it in so many other videos, but I've mentioned it in passing and I've never really delved really deep into it and what it means. So reading for me is a great way to improve your foreign language skills because it is just a very engaging activity. It is one that works on so many levels because it helps you learn many things without you even noticing that you're learning. That is what input does for you. Input just really helps put things into context, and in context, that's how you learn vocabulary, that's how you internalize grammar patterns without even realizing that you're doing it. And reading is not the only way to do that. You can also listen, you can also watch video or TV, movies, whatever. But at the end of the day, the point is that when you do something that's very input-based, that is very good for your learning. And if you do reading, then that's great because you have the ability to slow down and you can, reread, go back, check things, which is a little bit harder to do with video and audio formats. But with reading, it is great because it also engages your imagination, and when it engages your imagination, sometimes even your emotions, then things stick much more easily. And context is great for learning because our brain loves stories, our brain loves that type of pattern recognition, and pattern recognition with reading is something that is very easy to happen because you're just so engaged in trying to understand the story, especially if it's in a foreign language, that you're just really kind of trying to grasp the meaning, and all of that hard work is what really helps the brain learn, and it's what helps you remember vocabulary better as well. When you see a list of words, it's not necessary that you're going to remember those words. I don't care how much spaced repetition you do. Oftentimes we need to see the word in context. We need to see it at least in a phrase, and it's best if we see it in some type of story or in a short sentence, anything but just a list. I know that lists can sometimes be helpful. Some people like them. If you're one of those people, great, go ahead. But reading has many benefits for you, no matter who you are. And I think many of us enjoy reading. Now, beyond the ability to kickstart your language learning, of course, there's also many other benefits to reading that are more generic. I'm sure many of you know about them, how it develops your critical thinking and your imagination and knowledge in different topics, etc. There's been lots of research on that, but in the realm of language learning in particular, it is great both for vocabulary learning and then for learning how to express yourself, for doing chunking and learning different phrases and how people talk, or also it is great for grammar because it's just you see those patterns over and over again and you kind of pick up on the rules without even having read the rules, which is the best way to learn grammar is with context. So it can be an awesome activity. I feel like many times people don't really know how to read in a foreign language, and that can be something quite tricky, especially when you're not that advanced, and many people feel like they don't understand, and that, how do you do it when you have so many unknown words? And by the way, if you see this fly flying around the camera, I apologize. I don't know how to get it out. But anyways, let's continue. How do you pick what to read? This is the first step to any great experience with reading in a foreign language, because it is not as easy as in your native language. You can't just grab anything. You need to put a little bit of thought into it beforehand. It doesn't have to be books. Let's start off by saying that when I see reading, a lot of people think about books. It does not have to be books to be effective and to help with your learning. This is especially true in the beginning levels. If you are a beginner, it is very difficult to read a whole book, oftentimes because the language used in books is not that simple. And also because you really can't read that much in one sitting because there's so many unknown words. Actually, it is possible to read from day one, but it can be a bit challenging. So I would recommend you to get the basics of the language through some type of introductory book or introductory course or a series of videos on YouTube, whatever you prefer. Get a little bit of the basics first before you read. I think this is the best way to go, but of course, if you want to dive right in, feel free to disregard this rule. Language learning is all about personal preference and enjoyment. That being said, if you're a beginner, whether a complete one or you've kind of had a little bit of training with the language and now you want to start to read, I would recommend that you go with something shorter in the beginning because it is just very difficult when there's like a lot of unknown words and you can only sustain short pieces of reading. And so something that is very good for that is articles. I would say articles, be it on any topic, you can go on any website in your target language, any article. You could do an encyclopedia article, a news, or like some piece in like a magazine online that you read, whatever article you prefer. It can be very useful. And there's actually many useful extensions online like Google Translate and like similar ones that actually, once you install them, they allow you to double click on a word and get its meaning. And that can be very helpful if you're a beginner. If you're a beginner and you want to read, I would say you can either go for articles or you can go for something like a graded reader or a parallel text. I am not a big fan of those, but that is because I don't find them very interesting. If you like the stories of graded readers and that type of books, why not? There's nothing wrong with them. So keep that in mind. Whatever you find interesting, whether it be articles, whether it be like graded readers, parallel text, pick something that is interesting. That is rule number one, and then pick something that isn't too difficult. So a lot of the times it's going to be very hard to find something that's not too difficult. That's why I would say go for an article, go for a graded reader, because it is extremely difficult to otherwise do it. Children's books are something that is also quite often recommended. I have mentioned before how I don't think that that's a great idea, because I don't think that they're very good for most of us. Most of the times children's books are not very interesting for adults. And so if you try to read something that is not interesting for you just because it is simpler, it can be very difficult. It's hard to read something you don't enjoy. It's just difficult to stick with it. And especially, with today's world, so many distractions, there's so many interesting things to watch that it's just like, how are you going to read unless you're interested in the topic? So children's books, that's why I don't recommend them. If you think that they're interesting, great, then they could be amazing for you. But keep in mind that children's books, contrary to popular opinion, are not always very easy, and they often contain like language about animals and nature and plants that is not that easy, actually, I find, and that is not very relevant for the conversations that you're preparing to have in your target language. So I wouldn't say that they're the best, but again, to each their own. If you like them, go for them. I think that maybe comic books can be easy. There's adults that do like to read comic books, so that is like a better alternative to children's books, I feel, because there's not as much, there's like, usually visual aid to help you understand the story. There's not that much text, there's like short snippets of dialogue, so those can be actually a better option to children's books. Or as mentioned, the great readers, the articles. Another thing that you can do in the beginning is to reread a book that you've already read in a language that you speak fluently. So you already know it, more or less. It really makes it much easier. I know you don't know it by heart, etc. Yeah, but just knowing the story, or like if it's nonfiction, knowing what's being mentioned in that book, already knowing the material and knowing what it's about can help so much. Because with some words where you're like, you don't really know what they mean, but you're getting the gist of it, and so you can just focus on the language and the patterns, and you don't need to worry about understanding because you already know what it's about, then that's great. If you really hate to repeat books, and if you really don't like to reread books because you don't find it interesting, you find it boring to read the same thing over and over again, then perhaps don't do that. But at the end of the day, I feel like there are so many books that we can reread, especially ones that we've read years ago and we kind of know what they're about, but we've forgotten so much of them. So do try to see if you can find something like that. Another thing that can be useful in the beginning levels is a book like this. Alright, so I know that these books look quite funny, but the good thing is inside of it, you're gonna see like a lot of just like interesting snippets. Just to give you an example, like look at how short it is. Really, it's just like a little snippet of information that you can read really quickly, and it's not too difficult because, in the beginning, you cannot sustain it for that long. You can only do like a page a day or something. So a book like that, which has like those little facts to kind of read whenever you have 5 minutes, and it's just like this trivia compendium basically, can be actually quite nice at the beginning level. And then once you're intermediate, you can afford to do much more. That's the beauty of being intermediate. You can really read stuff that you're actually interested in. You don't need to read like the simple stories that were written for beginners, or like the children's book, or like books you've already read. You can actually do so much more, because at that level you understand more. And so it's important to be able to like not look up every single thing, and we're gonna touch upon that later, but just basically to make sure that you're not really at this stage where you're not understanding anything. You need to understand at least some of the words on the page. You need to have like a few unknown words, but not too many. It has to be just beyond your reach, but not too difficult, and also not too easy, because then you're not learning. So it's difficult to give like a number, oh, you need to have like 15 new words per page. I don't know, it doesn't matter, don't count them that much. It's not about how many new words exactly per page. It's like the perfect golden ratio of known to unknown. It's mostly about make sure that you pick a book that's like it's not like every other word that you don't know, right? It's like every couple of sentences there's a word you don't know. So that's something great to do in the intermediate level, and I have kind of hinted at this, but very important, especially at this stage and further, pick something that interests you, because that's easier to sustain. An example, again in German, of a book that I picked up was Viking Myths. I am looking forward to diving into this because I would like to, as I've mentioned before, my German isn't fluent yet, I want to get it fluent. I think reading is a great way to jump over the intermediate plateau. And so truly I am very interested in mythology, in any type of mythology. So of course I pick a book on a topic that I'm interested in, and then you're going to be focused on the topic. You're going to be understanding and learning much more rapidly because you're really interested to know what the author is saying, because that's something that interests you, the topic that you picked. And that's also, there's been actually a lot of research that suggests that that is why children learn our language, because they really want to understand what their parents are saying, and that's kind of what drives them to pick it up. And so you're kind of emulating the same thing. You really like the topic, you really want to understand what the author is saying, and that's what drives you to pick it up. Now, a book of myths or a book of little facts like the one that I showed you before, or a book that is on like another one that I've talked about, like The Brief History of Time, that I wanted to read and I got it in French. Any of those books are within the realm of non-fiction. Like, I know a lot of people think of myths as fiction, but they're not fiction as it's not Pride and Prejudice with the flowery language, with the super complicated words that people don't use in everyday speech, and with the very difficult to follow kind of words. Sometimes in those books it can be very challenging. Sometimes I have trouble reading in my native language because they use a lot of archaic words, especially, the older the fiction book that you're reading, the more archaic the words, and not just the words, they're going to use tenses that you never see used in everyday life. A lot of Portuguese books actually that I've come across have that, like a lot of tenses that no Portuguese speaker uses in everyday speech. So for that reason, I've mentioned it before, I always mention it, avoid fiction unless you're advanced. I don't think it's a good idea. Fiction is very tricky. It can even be tricky in our own native languages. Fiction is something that you might want to read. That might be your reason to learn a language. You might be learning Russian because you really want to read the great works of Russian literature, and that might be your goal. Perfect, but just like hold off on it until you're really comfortable with the language. Really start with like simpler books, start with nonfiction, start with articles, and then once you're advanced, then you can go for fiction. I think that if you do it earlier, again, break any rule if that's what you're interested in, but know that you're risking to be discouraged, because if it's extremely difficult, sometimes we can be discouraged with the book. If we, like every second word, we have no idea like what the author is saying, and we have to reread and go back and look up in a dictionary and go back, it can be very discouraging. So just kind of pick something that's just beyond your range, and fiction to be just a little bit beyond your ability. You have to be very advanced for that to happen. So once you're advanced, read whatever you want. That's wonderful. So yeah, my advice is to stick to nonfiction until you're advanced. Feel free, again, to just go for what you really are passionate about, and ignore my advice if you find that the difficulty doesn't discourage you. A very important tip for you is to not look up every word. Once you have picked your reading material, go ahead and start with it, but make sure that you don't look it up all the time. that really interrupts the process. It interrupts learning. It interrupts like pattern recognition that you would be getting otherwise, and it means that you learn less, unfortunately. I know how difficult it is. I'm just that type of person. When I sit down to read, if I don't understand a word, I go crazy, and it's really difficult to control myself and to not look up every word. But I've had to train myself to do that because I know how much of a difference it makes. I used to be that person that looked up every word when I was reading, and then actually it was thanks to this fortunate experience. Well, it didn't feel fortunate at the time because I was traveling and I had like a very little battery juice left on my phone, and so I just had to, not use my phone. And I was reading a book in another language, just kind of waiting on a train, and while I was waiting, I was reading this book, and I really wanted to look up certain words, but I couldn't afford it because I was like, okay, I'm not gonna drain my battery, I might need it, I'm traveling, don't touch the phone. So I couldn't look up any of the words. And I was reading and I had to push through, and it was wonderful the way that, when you have to push through and you're understanding like 90% of what's being written, but there's some words you don't get, but you kind of don't look them up because, again, your phone is about to die, you don't want to look them up. And it gives you this huge jump. I don't know how to explain it. The second that I started doing that, like that I stopped looking up every word, it just started flowing so much more. I started enjoying it. I started to feel like I'm learning so much more, and it didn't interrupt my flow. I was noticing these grammar patterns. I was picking up the meaning of the words from the context without looking them up, and it was interesting and it was engaging, and I felt like I was learning. And yeah, this is actually something that I feel like a lot of language learning advice on reading revolves around, not to look up every word. And it's advice that I completely agree with. I think it's an amazing piece of advice to follow because looking up every word is going to disrupt the flow, and it's going to turn reading from an activity that you enjoy to one that you don't. So learning decreases when you don't enjoy what you're doing, and it's also going to make it much more choppy. So at the end of the day, it is going to be, if you look up every word, it is going to be like a little bit like you're going through a list of words, and the learning, all of the value of reading, that is, picking up words within context, picking up grammar patterns within context, all of that is greatly diminished when you look up every word. So your learning suffers and your enjoyment suffers. And so I advise not to do it and control yourself. I learned to control myself. If I learn to control myself from looking up every word, you can do it too, trust me. So when do you look up words? Some people say that when you see a word repeated like 3 times or 5 times, it's good to look it up. Those are good numbers. I feel like there's no one golden number. I don't know, if you see a word repeated 4 times and you want to look it up, sure. So it's not about the number. It's just like, if it's just you come across it once or twice, don't look it up. If you see it repeated over and over in a sentence, in a paragraph, or like on a page, or like within the chapter, whatever, and you just don't know what it means, and all of the context isn't helping you, and you see it so many times already and you still can't figure it out, then you can look it up. But if it's just a word that you come across once, resist the temptation. Do you understand the sentence? If the answer is yes, resist the temptation and don't look it up. Now, if it's a word that is gonna completely spoil your reading pleasure because you're at the end of the paragraph and you're like, okay, I didn't understand what's happening because of that word, unlikely, but still, if that happens, look it up. But if not, just look it up once it's repeated a lot. And look it up after you finished your paragraph. And then once you look it up, go back and reread that paragraph if you want to, or if you feel like you're not in the rereading mood, then don't. I feel like there's no hardcore rules about this. But about looking up every word, I feel like there is a hardcore rule against that, because then it just spoils a lot of the pleasure and learning. So what if you are a beginner and then there's just so many words that you don't understand? What do you do then? Because you don't want to look them up, but at the same time it's like 5 words in a sentence that you don't get and you're wondering what to do. Well, then it might be useful to get a translation app, something like Google Translate on your phone. They have this option called, I think it's called Google Lens, where you activate your camera and you can kind of like move it over the text and you see it translated live. It just changes the words to your native language or whatever language you choose. it can be very useful. Look at that, see the meaning of the paragraph, and then go back and read it in your target language without looking at the words. So then you know the meaning, and you can kind of get on the words by context, and it can be very helpful. It is kind of a little bit like turning it into a parallel text, even though the book is not parallel text. So you can also do that if it's really challenging and you find it hard. Because that way you can get the meaning without necessarily interrupting your reading process and looking up the word. Should you reread? I feel like that is a question that depends on what you prefer to do. I feel like there's no hard and fast rule here. It is about what you prefer. So if you wanna reread, when should you do it? You should do it when it's very challenging. See, in the beginning, there's no easier book that you can pick. It's just hard. So then it might be good once you've gone with Google Lens, or maybe you've looked up a few words that have popped up many times, and so you've kind of interrupted the process. Once you've interrupted the process for one reason or another, because I'm saying minimize interruptions, but you are gonna have interruptions. So once you've done that, once you've interrupted the process, you might enjoy to go back and reread the sentence or the paragraph or the whole chapter, whatever you prefer. If you feel like that helps you solidify the information in your head, try it out, see if it works. If you don't like it because you don't like repetitiveness and that bores you, then don't do it. It's not a big deal either way, and I don't think that there's that you're going to be better or worse for rereading or for not rereading. Try it out and see if it works for you. Another question that is possible with reading is, should you read out loud? That obviously depends on where you are. If you're in the comfort of your own home, you can do whatever you want. I think it could be useful because it's like a little bit like shadowing, like that technique of like repeating, you know, when you're listening to a podcast or something. You can also do it with reading that way. You know, you can read, but then you can also say it out loud, so you're practicing the pronunciation and everything. I think that there's a value in reading out loud, much more so in the beginning stages of learning a language rather than the later. But it can certainly be nice for practicing speaking and pronunciation, that kind of stuff, and shadowing and repeating. It depends on your learning style, but for some people, saying something out loud really helps information stick in their heads. So again, it is one of those things that is like, if it fits your learning style and if you like it, do it, and if you don't, don't. In any case, I think it can be useful. It can help solidify. It engages more senses and like more of you, just like by not just engaging your mind and your eyes, but it also engages, you know, auditory and speaking aspects of learning, so it can help. What about taking notes? Should you take notes? As in taking notes of phrases or words that you like, that you come across that were unknown before. I feel it can be helpful if it doesn't spoil your reading pleasure. It spoils mine, which is why I don't do it, but I know that like many successful polyglots, they have these notebooks in which they write words and phrases that they came across in reading that were previously unknown to them, and then they go back and review it. So that can be something very helpful, I know, from other people. Personally, for me, if it spoils the pleasure, it doesn't work. But if it doesn't spoil your pleasure and you feel like writing and like you're that type of motion learning person, that you learn really well, because there's some people that learn really, really well when they write something down. So again, it goes back to knowing yourself. If you know that it's your learning style, it's wonderful. And if you feel like it spoils your pleasure, like it does for me, then hold off on that. So I've gone over a lot of like stuff that are optional, depend on your learning style. Something that I feel like isn't optional, which is not looking up every word. I feel like that is pretty universal, I'd say, because I do feel like it disrupts everybody's process. So besides, you know, picking something that is level appropriate, something that's just beyond your reach, and besides making sure that you don't interrupt the flow, I think something very important as well is to trust the process, because reading, a lot of times it can feel very, very challenging. It can feel as if you're not going anywhere with it. There's so much you don't know. It can be really frustrating, especially as a beginner, and you stare at this page and you've read this paragraph 5 times and you're like, oh, I'm still not getting it. And it's like, it can be extremely difficult in the beginning. So this is more like a beginner's advice than an advanced person's advice, but really in the beginning it can be very discouraging sometimes. But reading, I would say it's one of the keys to my success with languages. Reading, listening, watching video content, those type of input-based activities, they can be really discouraging sometimes, because you feel like this is difficult, especially with reading, because sometimes the language can be complex and you feel like you're going nowhere. You are learning and you need to trust the process. And it's very difficult if you've never learned with reading and with stories before, because you don't have that proof that it works. But I would love to just give you this confidence that it works. Trust me, it does. It is one of the things that I do for language learning that I find is very useful. And when the times when it's like the hardest, when you feel like this is hopeless, I'm not going anywhere, it's so difficult, that's when you learn the most. So trust the process and know that the more you read, the easier it's going to get. And it's actually something that is very helpful, because it helps you internalize the language and it helps you learn in a way that is natural to the human condition, as opposed to reading tables of grammar, which is not natural and which is very hard to tap into later when you want to speak. Whereas with reading, it gives you this vocabulary, this way of expressing yourself, this way of using patterns and using words because you've seen them in context, and then it becomes natural, because through the power of story, the human brain learns very easily. It becomes natural, you internalize it, and you're able to speak better as a result. Something that you cannot achieve with most of the traditional methods of language learning. So trust the process. That is the biggest piece of advice I have on reading. And if you find it hard to commit yourself to that habit because it is difficult to read, because, for example, you feel like you're very distracted, then go in a distraction-free environment, put your phone on Do Not Disturb, and just, if it helps you, put it on your schedule, right? On like 30 minutes every day, or like every other day, however often you want. You're going to have it on your calendar and you're going to dedicate time specifically for reading. That can be very helpful for somebody that's like, I find it hard to create the habit. It can be easy to set it in stone in a way, or don't even do 30, do like 10 minutes. You're going to see that once you start reading for 10 minutes, oftentimes you're going to be interested in the topic and you're going to keep reading more. So that can be really useful if you feel like it's difficult to make yourself do it, because it does require a bit of push, especially if it's in a language that's hard. And lastly, I'd love to iterate to tailor this to your own experience, learning style, and who you are, because sometimes it can really, like, all of the rules and stuff can really change for you because of your own lens. What I mean by that is that it's gonna depend. You know, sometimes you can start reading fiction very early on. If it's a language that is very close to one you already speak, and you recognize a lot of the vocabulary, yes, even the hyper flowery vocabulary that exists in fiction, then it can be easy for you. I did this experiment recently where I picked up Anna Karenina, and my Russian is like something that I've learned very little Russian, and then I kind of let it go for a while because I just had so much going on in like other areas of my life, and with work and with YouTube, and then with learning other languages and improving other languages. I kind of tend to drop languages and get back to them. So I kind of dropped Russian, and I've really just like learned the basics. And I did this experiment when I picked up Anna Karenina, and I was like, okay, let me see if I can read fiction in Russian, even though I've had like very little Russian training. That's why I don't list it as one of the languages that I speak ever, because I'm just so new. But I was like going through this book and I was like, oh, I can understand so much. So there goes the fiction rule right out the window, because I guess in Slavic literature, like a lot of the roots of the words are similar. And so for Russian, it's really that the grammar is so different from my native Bulgarian, but the vocabulary is not. So I'm able to understand so much of it. It's so much, really. So I feel like, you know, when I have some time, I can just go back to and read that book, even though I'm a complete beginner in Russian. So that's the thing. It's some of those things are rules that they, in general, fiction, yes, it's very hard. So if I start reading fiction in German right now, it's going to be very difficult for me, because I don't really speak a Germanic language that's very heavily Germanic based, right? Like English is Germanic, but a lot of the vocabulary is Romance. So if I start with German fiction and with my intermediate level in German, that's going to be super challenging for me. But Russian fiction with my beginner level in Russian is not that challenging, just because my native language is very similar to Russian, the vocabulary is very similar. So for a Spanish speaker, Portuguese fiction might be accessible very early on. So my point is, you know, a lot of those things are They depend to a large extent. And when you can start reading in a language also depends, because if you are learning a language that's similar, vocabulary speaking in particular, to a language that you already speak, you can start reading much sooner, and you can start reading more complicated things much sooner. So it's going to depend if the language is something that you know or not. One of the reasons that I really want to learn Persian is Persian poetry, and I know that that's very far off in the future for me. Right now I'm looking at the writing system. That's what I'm doing, nothing more. But it's just the vocabulary is would be very difficult for me in that language, I'm sure. So what I can do in Russian is not going to be the same as what I can do in Persian. Keep that in mind. I wanted to just have that little disclaimer at the end about how reading, it can be really influenced by vocabulary more than anything, more than grammar, more than are you a beginner, are you advanced. So keep that caveat in mind. And at the end of the day, just think about, when you're thinking about your strategy with reading, think about your learning style, how you learn best. That's going to help you also with, should I write things down, should I read out loud, and all of those questions that we unpacked earlier. But if I have to summarize, the most important thing is to pick something that you feel is just difficult enough, not too easy, not too difficult, and then to also go for something that interests you, because otherwise it's difficult to create a habit, and make sure that the flow isn't interrupted and that you're resisting to look up every word. Those are the three most important things, I feel. Everything else can be bent based on your personal situation. So keep flexible. That's very important in language learning in general, not just with reading. If there's anything that I missed on reading that you're interested in, if there's a question that's burning a hole through your mind right now and you really want an answer, ask me in the comments and I'll be happy to give you my advice. If you like this video and would like to see more of that, please like and subscribe, hit the bell for notifications so you know when I upload the next video. And with that being said, I will see you very soon and I wish you a wonderful day. Bye bye.